Good evening again. A very warm welcome to tonight's discussion with the title Militarization for Peace, ? How the West Deals with the Crisis in Wartime Europe. My name is Maria MALTSCHNIG. I am the director of the Karl-Renner-Insitut, and I'm very delighted that we got to be a partner at this event. The public debate tonight is the closure and highlight of this year's Vienna Peace and Security Talks. Around 30 experts, former politicians, civil society representatives gathered to discuss the shifting grounds of European security. Over the years, the Vienna Peace and Security Talks have become an important forum of exchange and discussion of current trends and important issues when it comes to the European security architecture. We focus on conflicts and conflict resolution in the neighborhood of the EU, on the geopolitical standing of the European Union, but also on the OSCE area. The necessary reform of this organization that has its seat in Vienna was one of the key elements in our discussions in the last couple of years. The closed-door discussions that we had earlier today and that we are continuing tonight with open doors is happening under the impression of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, where people experience, particularly today, a very dark day. We all know that this war has massive consequences for the European political landscape, but also for the world order. So, the question on how to deal with and how to overcome the new disorder in European security architecture was one of the main themes that we discussed earlier today. We also touched upon possible scenarios for the resolution of the conflict. We discussed the question of the idea of a geopolitical European Union is an illusion or already reality, and what needs to be done by the EU in order to be perceived as a credible global player. And we discussed, as we did the years before, how we could revitalize the OSCE and particularly in this moment create something like a new Helsinki process. This seems to be not very realistic under the current circumstances, but we are convinced that we have to lay the ground for this better sooner than later. The public debate now is the final highlight and to some extent also the synthesis of our conference. The title we chose is quite provocative: Militarization for Peace. The West delivers heavy arms to Ukraine so that the country is able to defend itself. Western states invest more or less massively in defense, and all this is understandable. However, the moment where diplomacy will be needed will come. Our panelists tonight will also discuss the reaction of the EU to the Russian aggression and the unity of the West. And they will speak about what is left from a common Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and possible ways to rebuild something like a European security architecture in the medium and long term. There are many issues to discuss, and I look forward to the debate. Let me thank the cooperation partners of this event. The Vienna Peace and Security Talks are jointly organized by the Karl-Renner-Insitut and 3 other institutions that are also during the year important partners for us. This is the FES Regional Office for International Cooperation here in Vienna, the Viennese office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, the International Institute for Peace, and the Society for Eurasian Studies. Many thanks for the good cooperation. And now I would like to hand over to the moderator of tonight's discussion, Christos KATSIOULIS, who is head of the FES Regional Office for International Cooperation here in Vienna. Let me wish you and all of us a fruitful debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thanks all of you for joining us tonight. As Maria already said, that is the open door part of a closed workshop. So what we're trying to do is look at the militarization for peace question we put into the title with this panel for about 50 to 60 minutes, and then I'll try to open up and allow you also some questions towards the panel. The things we're discussing normally in these Vienna peace and security talks are issues that you find on the 3rd or 4th page of your newspaper, normally, not today. Today the situation is very different. We had the attacks on Kiev this morning continuing right now. So it is far more urgent, the discussion we have right now about security, about peace in Europe, and how to deal with the crisis that is very close to our borders here. Just remember, Ukraine is closer than France to Vienna. And I'm very happy to be joined by a panel of experts and also a decision maker to discuss these issues. On my right is Louisa Biawajevich, a political geographer, professor of European governance at the University of Amsterdam, and also teacher at the Collège d'Europe in Natolin. To my far right, and that's not a political thing, is General Frank, who's the director of the cabinet of the chairman of the EU Military Committee. To my left is Alexandra Matash, special advisor to the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And to my very left is Hannes SWOBODA, former MEP, currently the president of the International Institute for Peace, and we're very well known probably here in Vienna. And as you might have guessed, we have a very broad perspective here. Hannes brings a perspective from Brussels as well as Vienna, Alexandra from Switzerland as well as from Russia, Louisa from various countries, not only the Netherlands, but also Poland, and as far as I understood, also Italy. And General Frank is right now in Brussels, but has this broader European perspective. So we try to cover a lot of views on these issues right now. What I try to do at the beginning, look at the status quo, how we deal with things, and then try to look a little bit forward about what could be done and what could be perspectives and scenarios for the coming weeks and months. And you saw what happened in the past months. In the very first days of the war, the prognosis was in 3 days it's over. That changed right now. Ukrainian victory seems imminent. I was in Poland last week, and there the discussion was already about what do we do when Russia dissolves. So things are moving quite quickly, and nobody knows what's coming the next day. So we'll be very, very cautious on that issue. But let me start with looking at what the European Union is doing and asking General Frank. Today we had a debate about the EU as a geopolitical actor, and it was quite dismal. And let me describe it in the words of a former German politician who said the European Union on the world stage is like a vegetarian in a world of carnivores. So let us look a little bit closer, despite the quips. How's the European Union right now handling this crisis? What are we currently doing in the field? Can you give me a picture of that, please?
Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the organizers. Big thank you for this invitation. And I think there could hardly be a better place than here to have a more broader strategic outlook and have an open and free-minded discussion. Of course, I have to say that tonight I'm neither speaking for my boss, General Brieger, the chairman of the EU Military Committee, nor on behalf of the Ministry of Defense of Austria, but solely in my personal capacity. So, having said this, I think, you might ask yourself, how come that an Austrian general from a neutral country like Austria becomes the head, the highest ranking military officer within the European Union? Isn't this a contradiction? Neutrality and CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy. And no, this is not a contradiction because our constitution, our legal system, in accordance with our political interpretation, does not contradict an active position of Austria within the European security and defense system. So we might come back to this later on, but this explains a little bit our current situation. We are from time to time confronted with this question in Brussels, as you can imagine. Let me start by answering your question. So how is the EU handling the crisis? So for many observers, I think surprisingly well. So the EU so far with regard to Ukraine has been united. its support has been sustainable, strong, and in a comprehensive manner. It's not just about military support. And this is a big difference to the time when the war started in 2014. So but in my first statement, I would like to refer to this confrontation, this strategic challenge we see these days. This is not only about the Ukraine, and from my point of view, I would like to offer 4 levels for our analytical framing of this situation. Of course, we have the conventional war in Ukraine, ongoing in Ukraine, with the Ukraine on the initiative, definitely on the initiative, but still far away from a decisive military outcome. And this is the bad news, and we have seen it this morning, and the bad news is that we might see it in the near future, that further escalation is to be expected. This is really the bad news. So we're really in a long struggle which will not end overnight. But it's not only about the conventional war ongoing in Ukraine. We have, as a second layer of this confrontation, we have the hybrid war. Also, I'm not so happy with this notion of war, but I think this is so commonly accepted these days, of Russia against Europe. So we see that Europe, that our societies, our nations, we are very vulnerable when it comes to our strategic infrastructure, when it comes to our cyber infrastructure, our energy dependence. I think here we have really a form of militarization, namely a militarization of all dependencies. So this is one common notion we see. We have created during the high times of globalization many dependencies, and these are now, all of them are now being weaponized or used against us. And then we have a third level, and we must not neglect it. We have the confrontation with Russia is fought out also in the regional dimension, in regional conflicts. Yeah? We see it, of course, with the great influence Russia still has, for example, on the Western Balkans. So these days we have the discussion about prolonging the mandate for the EU mission in EUFOR in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where we need, of course, the consensus of Russia in the United Security Council. Yeah? We see the confrontation with Russia, for example, in Western Africa. We see these mercenary Wagner groups, Russian-led so-called Wagner group. We see it in Mali. We see it already in the RCA, as in Central Africa. And last week there was this coup in Burkina Faso, where we also could see on the street Russian flags. So we must not neglect this dimension of the confrontation. And of course, but I will not elaborate on this too much, we have a global dimension, because this confrontation with Russia has huge impact on the food crisis, on the, let's say, it's a battle of narrative, which is played out in the global south, and we are not doing, we as Europeans, we are not doing very well in this regard as well. So what is the European Union doing on these 4 levels? So with regard to the war in Ukraine, the European Union has so far provided military equipment with approximately 4 billion euro. This is for the first time that the European Union is, we could say, a geopolitical actor. This was not the case in the past. And this is just what the European Union as a whole is doing. This is not including bilateral support by EU member states. And the new project here to be mentioned is the EU is preparing a so-called military assistance mission for training up to 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers on EU soil, not in the Ukraine, but on the EU territory. This is also a paradigm shift, because so far CSDP has just been about out-of-area crisis management, and there was a legal interpretation that the CSDP activities are not allowed on EU soil. With regard to the hybrid war, the second dimension, we see that the European Union is just can assist member states, and member states are responsible for protecting their own critical infrastructure, but the European Union is doing its best to coordinate national measures, to provide a common operational picture by a so-called hybrid fusion cell where all the informations come together. And according to the Strategic Compass, our latest strategic document, we are also providing rapid response tools, civil military rapid response tools in order to support any member states who is a victim of a hybrid attack. On the third level, the regional conflict, the EU is currently undertaking 18 civilian and military missions. Yeah? So this is quite a huge number. But what we see less and less and less support by the member states for these so important missions. Yeah? So everyone is focusing on deterrence, conventional defense, yeah? And this could, from my point of view, especially be the added value based on the comprehensive approach that the European Union, in some form of a division of labor with NATO, is taking care of these regional conflicts which are taking place all around the strategic neighborhood of Europe, and prevent that things even become worse. And on the fourth level, on the global level, I think we must not neglect this, and it's important to say it's not about just military investment in our security, but we need at the same time to maintain our development aid, our humanitarian aid, to do our best to tackle this, the effects of the Ukraine crisis on the global south. I think I stop here. I have some further remarks maybe for later on.
Thank you very much, General Frank. And I think it has become rather clear that the European Union is doing a lot of things, maybe not always in the spotlight, but they'll be done. Let me turn to Louisa and look at one dimension you didn't mention in your remarks, General, the dimension of internal European cohesion and at the society level. Because that crisis has also affected the societies. People are asked to heat less, to use less gas, for example, and we have different moods in different parts of the continent, for example. I mentioned I was in Warsaw, and we had in the Iraq War this division between the old and the new Europe. Do we see something like that, new centers of gravity, new dynamics, or even a strengthening of populists right now in Europe?
Thank you for that question, and I'll try to actually follow up directly on General Frank's comments. So, my immediate answer is, are we seeing divides developing in Europe? Yes, but, in saying that yes, I would kind of try to, moderate that and modify it. Because on the one hand, I think we need to go beyond, kind of the easy grand narratives of suddenly, we see an unprecedented forms of European unity, the geopolitical awakening of Europe. I mean, I think we're all very well familiar with these narratives. So I think we need to avoid those, but we also need to avoid the opposite. I think we need to avoid stressing the divides as well, because I think those are that can be very much kind of fomenting these narratives of division and weakness, especially neglects what Europe is actually doing, or I should specify what the EU and its member states are doing. So, kind of thinking about the divides that are there, certainly, if we look at the first months of the war, unprecedented things did happen. I mean, whether, both unprecedented in their reach, but also the speed at which they happened. Whether it's the sanctions package, stepping up military spending, really in quite unprecedented ways, arms transfers, agreeing to arms transfers to a third state, but also, and I think this is equally important, agreeing on the Temporary Protection Directive, which was unprecedented. I mean, we didn't see it in 2015, 2016. We didn't see it subsequently in other migration crises, so I think this is very relevant. And since then, it would be very tempting to say, that this unity has disintegrated. The situation has, in fact, become much more complicated. And Natalie Tocci wrote a great piece on foreign affairs this August, asking, can Russia divide Europe? And I usually agree with Natalie on everything. On this, I would be slightly more cautious, because the answer she gives is that it's actually very likely. But I guess I would say that the divides that we're seeing are actually much longer standing, and they've perhaps only been much more starkly visible with the war, and in some cases turbocharged. So whether it is, the Polish geopolitical orientation, which, I was in Warsaw last week as well, and it was very much in evidence, that this is a very different perspective than, I'm actually Italian, despite my very Polish name, certainly the discussions in Italy. But these divides, kind of coming back to the broader question that you raised, don't only regard geopolitical orientations, but a variety of other questions, including political economic ones. And this is coming to your point regarding the energy crisis. And here, I guess I would echo what one of our colleagues said this morning, that you cannot separate geopolitics from political economy. I'm stating the obvious, but we really cannot. And the discussions surrounding how to tackle, how to govern the energy crisis are revealing. And this crisis is firmly part of this geopolitical moment. And whether this is the discussions regarding a possible gas price cap, or how the proposal from Paolo Gentiloni and Thierry Breton was immediately shot down, their proposal to issue further debt to tackle the economic fallout from the energy crisis. And, I say this because I think it's very tempting, to kind of identify the lack of a united front among EU states. This is not just a division among member states on the extent or form of military assistance that should be provided, the sort of military role desired for Europe, but also, I think, very different understandings, orientations, and other forms of response. And, coming back to the Breton-Gentiloni kerfuffle, the old divide between the famous frugals and being based in the Netherlands right now, the Dutch were at the front of this. This was a replay from the discussions over the recovery fund. So this doesn't only have to do with the war, and I think it would be wrong to place it there. I'll say another thing that I think is quite obvious. There have always been divisions, differing visions, not just between member states, but also within member states, over what the EU is, over what it should be, and what it is for. What is the purpose of our union, and what should it do, and what should it not? So this, again, is not new. So I would, as I said, while recognizing these divides, be very wary of exaggerating them, because it really risks undermining what we are actually doing and risks depotentiating what we are doing, including various other forms of actorness, of power, and I would use that term, that do not pass solely through military might. So I think we need to be aware of this also, because this way we risk feeding into the critics of the EU. And, many criticisms are valid, but we really risk feeding both populist forces at home, but also critics abroad who, very, kind of adamantly, and these are also, let's say, and I think many kind of historical echoes here, insist on telling the EU what it should be doing, and that it doesn't properly recognize the dangers of the world, that it is somehow, inconsistent, kind of take your pick of adjectives. And so I think, while recognizing those divides, we do not want to feed the narrative of a Europe that is divided, confused, unable to act. If anything, at this moment, we need to build Europeans' trust. And I think I'll throw in one more word here that I think is important, and we seem to have set aside. We talk a lot about solidarity with Ukraine, but I think we also need to focus on solidarity at home to European citizens, among member states. So I think that's something that needs to be brought back into the discussion, which is both geopolitical and political economic. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And you can't have an event of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung as well as the Karl-Renner-Insitut without the word solidarity. So you're right at home here. Thank you very much. But let me turn to Hannes and open the perspectives a little bit, because we looked at Europe and we will discuss the purpose of Europe later on. But we asked in our title how the West deals with this crisis. And it seems to be that the West is back somehow, but what do we mean about that? And how has the war, from your point of view, affected the dynamics between the European Union and NATO on the one hand, Europe and the United States? We could also mention the United Kingdom that is back on the scene, although Johnson is gone. And what about the OSCE here in Vienna? So how is the broader West dealing with this crisis and be affected by it?
Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your question. Well, during my 18 years in European Parliament, I was for most of the time member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also of the Defense Subcommittee. So we had already a Defense Subcommittee without having a defense policy really of the European Union. But when we organized the first visit of the Foreign Affairs Committee in NATO headquarters, and they are 10 to 15 minutes drive away from the European institutions, it was a bit of a shock for some people. Not only because, not because of the neutrality, but because some people said, look, these are two different organizations, you cannot mingle and mix it. Nowadays it's different. Not yet in a final stage, so to say, but it is different. And I think it is important that the cooperation, and I was always for that kind of cooperation, because the alternative would be that the European Union will itself be a military organization. You cannot defend or care for security in Europe if you don't have also a military dimension. And that can be organized together with NATO, or it could be done only on the European level. And I think it would be enormous waste of money if the European Union would go for militarization of itself in the sense of a European army separate from the NATO. So, of course, this criticism came from both sides, from those who said only NATO is responsible, like Denmark until recently. Now they changed the course and all of a sudden supporting also a European defense policy. But it came also from some of the European people who said we don't have to have these kind of contacts. No, it is absolutely important. Yes, you are right, the West is regaining some status. The question is, what is the West? And I think we discussed it very much today with the US. Yes, unfortunately, we are dependent on the US. But again, what would be the alternative? Some people deplore that NATO is still here. But could you imagine what would have happened if NATO would not exist? How far Russia already would be, a Russia of Mr. Putin? Because Putin did not say, okay, if you dissolve NATO, we will skip and will destroy our nuclear arms and so on. He cannot do it. He couldn't do it because of China anyway. So I think we have to recognize also in a neutral country like Austria that the existence of NATO and the existence of a military side of the European Union in the sense of defense policy, what General Frank said, is absolutely necessary also for our security. But to think security can be done and organized and saved only by military means it's absolutely wrong. General Frank mentioned two external actions or regions where we have also Russia active. The Balkan, and as I think it was Dimitrov, the former foreign minister from North Macedonia, who is also here, said, yeah, Russia is a spoiler there. But to defend the security against the spoiler, you cannot just send military. Yes, it would be necessary, like you're for in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but you have also to have another kind of policy for the security, the integration of the Balkan countries, which is also for Austria very important, but we have not enough steps also from the European Union side, also not from the countries themselves. Second region you mentioned was Africa. You see the failure of some of the military activities in Western Africa because it was seen only from the military side. To fight against terrorist Islamist group, you need military dimension, but you need also to think about why are people supporting these groups, these terrorist groups. Why? Because partly the governments in the region, in different countries, are failing to deliver minimum security to their own citizens. What is the alternative for them? They go for those groups who seem to offer security for them. And these are sometimes Islamist group, or sometimes even the Wagner group, even if many people are very disappointed when they see what the Wagner group is doing. So yes, I'm very much for this kind of cooperation between European Union and NATO. Not that they are identical, but this cooperation is absolutely necessary. Now we come to the last point, to the OSCE. Unfortunately, for the moment, is some sort of a brain dead, to use this phrase, because already in the past years, it was not really functioning. Look, for example, in eastern Ukraine. Russia, partly was in Ukraine, but mainly Russia, did prevent the OSCE to do a really good job. Also, they did whatever they could. We have been from the IIP and discussed again and again in Ukraine also the activities there, but they were very much limited. They had not a power to really intervene. They had the power to observe. If you observe, then you observe the violations by Russian side and you observe the violations by Ukraine side, but that does not help. And as we see, with purpose, especially Russia did prevent a real active OSCE mission there. But there's an old saying, if you want to prepare for peace, prepare war. If you want to have peace, prepare war. I would say if you want to have peace, you have to be preparing a war, but even more to prepare peace. So I think what has been the discussion today also was, now we are in a terrible situation. There is no way to discuss with Mr. Putin a new OSCE and a new European Security Forum. But we have to look beyond Mr. Putin. We have to look beyond the war, even if it's difficult, to think about what happens afterwards. When I read in the newspaper, I think it was today, that the advisor to Mr. Zelensky in Ukraine criticized that the Nobel Peace Prize was given to some Russian organizations who are the victim of Putin's policy. It's absolutely crazy. We have to find ways to have contacts with these people. We have to praise and support this kind of people, because a new OSCE framework has to be done with new people in Russia, whoever they will be, and it will not be easy. But we must not, we must not forget that there must be a time when the war is over. There must be a time when Mr. Putin is no longer in charge of Russia, and there must be a time when we can at least start again to talk about peace, also with Russia.
Thank you very much, Hannes. And we'll come to that aspect in a second. But talking about peace is also something that has happened during the war, Alexandra. And although we're discussing, especially in German, only the question, do we send heavy weaponry or what kind of tank do we send? Diplomacy was very much on the backsides of the newspapers. So if you look at the negotiations that have taken place in Istanbul, for example, have they been just a failure? Are there any other efforts right now underway to solve or kind of manage the crisis? Are there kind of signs of hope you can identify in this process right now?
Thank you very much, Christos, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this distinguished panel. Well, I think I will start with agreeing with the previous speakers also that basically now we observe that the European security order is clearly dominated by the deterrence. And after the 24th of February, the concept of cooperative security is in a very difficult situation. On the negotiations, we know that last round of political negotiations between Russia and Ukraine happened at the end of March, beginning of April in Istanbul. And since then, they are suspended. There are no negotiations, any direct negotiations planned in the foreseeable future. Both parties continue to seek for advantages on the military field. I believe it's still interesting to look what was discussed both in Minsk and in Istanbul by the two delegations. According to the Istanbul communique, both sides, both Russian and Ukrainian sides, were rather close on agreeing on the neutral status of Ukraine and also multilateral security guarantees for the country. We know that there were still divergences on the territorial issues. Of course, at that time, the discussion was only about Donbas and Crimea. There was still no discussion about the south of Ukraine, which is now under Russian control, the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. But then, due to tragic events in Bucha and Irpin and no desire of the Western powers to have any negotiations with the Russian Federation, after that, these talks were indefinitely suspended. And now we don't know what was discussed, what is still on the list for Ukraine, but I think it's still useful to know what have been already on the table. To be fair, we need to remember that there were some successful negotiations, for instance, on the prisoners exchange, with the International Committee of Red Cross being involved, and also the grain deal with the United Nations and Turkey facilitating this deal. Now, during this hot phase of war, there's clearly no appetite or for any official negotiations, official discussions, the so-called track 2 dialogue. The doctrine that we observed after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, the doctrine of no business as usual, is now replaced by no business at all. And at the moment, no one wants to speak about dialogue or detente. And very often, basically, even the idea of dialogue with Russia in the West is seen as a reward for good behavior. But the question we can ask ourselves if the dialogue actually can be used as a diplomatic tool. So you asked us to maybe come up with some suggestions and recommendations. Well, first of all, I think it is interesting to look at the role of the neutral states. We're here in Austria. I come from Switzerland. Even though our two countries also now start thinking about neutrality, maybe on neutrality policy, at least at Switzerland, we are not discussing the legal core of neutrality, but mostly the neutrality policy. There were few questions after Switzerland joined the EU sanctions on Russia, if Switzerland is still a neutral state. But there was clearly majority of population that support this joining of sanctions because of the violations of international law by the Russian Federation, and doesn't seem that it undermines the neutrality of the country. So the role of these states right now can be, in this polarized environment, can be very useful. We in Switzerland now trying to achieve the balancing act between, on one hand, preserving and advocating for respect of international norms and principles, and at the same time maintaining dialogue with difficult, non-like-minded actors like Russia or China. So I would say that we still need to maintain those channels of communication. It is very important to avoid any misinterpretation, misperception in this unpredictable environment. And when all official contacts are suspended, there is no track 1 exchanges, I would argue that the discussions between experts are very important. The institution that I'm working for instance, is one of the few institutions that is replying to this need for dialogue. And what can be discussed, again, is another question. There are certain issues that don't have a military solution, such as transnational threats, where we still need to work with Russia to have a certain dialogue. To give you an example, it's the issue of climate change, for instance, where we still need to have communication. There are also, for instance, some geographical contexts when we need to maintain these exchanges on North Korea, Syria. We know that negotiations on Iran are still happening. And maybe my final point is that we also need to think right now it is not possible at this stage, but in the future, as Hannes said, we need to start thinking and preparing for future dialogue on the European security. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me ask a follow-up question to General Frank regarding what Hannes said. We need to prepare for peace. If I understood you correctly, you said we can expect further escalation in this war. There's probably a war of attrition coming between Ukraine and Russia. There's this military assistance facility prepared by the European Union. So you prepare for a longer war. Do you also prepare for peace? Do you prepare or even discuss the moment after in the European Union, if you can disclose something of that? Okay. And be short so we can sometime give back to the public.
Yeah. Now, I think we need both at the same time, and I would call it the immediate operational crisis management, so the immediate military assistance, yeah, for Ukraine, yeah, in order to have its own legitimate national self-defense, yeah. But at the same time, yeah, we need what I would call strategic diplomacy, and this is not a contradiction. This is not a contradiction. Strategic diplomacy from my side means that we have like we as military call it, we have to define our desired end state. Yeah? So we have to think it through to the end. So what is in the long-term strategic European interest? Yeah? Which type of security order? And then from then backwards, yeah, decide and more coordinate our immediate short to medium assistance and activities.
Thank you very much. Louisa, could you describe a desired end state that, let's say, Poland, Estonia, Cyprus, Greece and Austria can agree upon?
My immediate answer would be no, which doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards. But I mean, that's precisely it. I mean, that's I think what I was also trying to allude to. The desired, kind of European futures are very different. They always have been, and so I think, in this moment, kind of pretending they're not, is I think a bit naive. But I think if we really kind of start thinking across the four scales that you identified and, understand that, apart from the variety of implications, which are not only military, I mean, these are very different geographies. And I mean, I remember my Polish colleagues insisting that, you in the south and in the north, don't feel this, you don't have this historical, legacy of being able to perceive this threat so closely. That is very true. And, certainly there are also other ongoing conflicts that we need to pay attention to. So, I think, the geographies that matter are very different. But in terms of imagining a single desired European security architecture or a single desired endpoint, I think we're not there yet, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't start talking about it precisely, because that is already necessary now.
Yeah, and I would like to remind ourselves that the European Union, in its beginning, or the European communities, was a peace project. So maybe trying to apply that to today's circumstances, Hannes. What could be the initiative by the European Union? What could be actions by Europeans, maybe putting together European member states as well as the European Union, to apply this kind of peace project to the different levels the General outlined? Maybe not directly in Ukraine, but also the other fields. He mentioned the hybrid wars, but also the regional dimension, the Western Balkans, as well as the global dimension, the dialogue with the global South, for example.
Well, I think there are of course, common interests. Let's take the hybrid wars or the cyber attacks. We can go into a future where we attack each other. You know, we attack each other, computer systems, we attack each other, pipelines, electricity connections. This will be a disaster. So we can, of course, bomb us back in a way, or not bomb us, but cyber attack us back into the past. And that would be a disaster for all of us. So at the end, that would be really a catastrophe for all of us, and we don't have an interest in it. You mentioned the environment. If you look at the energy sector, Russia wants to sell gas. We need still gas for some time. We cannot do without gas for some time in going into the transition. Also, Russia needs a transition. The wrong policy of Mr. Putin has been to think, I deliver gas, 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 and don't think about the future. Also, Russia has to have that transition from gas away towards sustainable energy. If you look what happens, especially in the East, and because of the climate change, Russia could have or should have more interest in stopping this kind of chaotic climate change than we in Western Europe. So it could be, for example, that we go together into the scientific research concerning concrete policies, from hydrogen to other policies. What do we do when the warming of the earth is continuing, and we have that kind of tundra and CO2 emissions and methane gas emissions. So I think there are many common subjects. So my conclusion would be not start with Ukraine. Well, there's another issue, but we discuss with Mr. Putin, look now, let's stop the war and give back everything you had and we will be friends again. No, but we have to address the scientific community in Russia, the environmental interested people in Russia, ordinary citizens, the second level elite, not the top elite which is leading the war. This should be the initiative for the European Union in the sense of in the purpose of peace.
Thank you very much. We're discussing European security architecture here, and I think we all agree that after the 24th of February, lots of the European security architecture after the Cold War lies in tatters. What you just described is kind of an island of necessary cooperation we need with Russia in the future. Alexandra, what other elements could you imagine for a future European security architecture, if we're looking for the long-term perspective, that could be also integrating Russia? And I know that's a difficult one.
Yes, I think it's a difficult question, and which requires a lot of thinking. I think I also said this earlier today, that we need not to forget that we had already issues with the European security order well before the 24th of February. And in different narratives, there are basically different dates and different historical perspectives even on when this confrontation started. I remember very well the report of the panel of eminent persons in 2015, when even those experts who meet together, who know each other from the OSCE space, they didn't manage to agree on what were the historical origins of the renewed Russia-West confrontation back in 2015. So I think, yes, that's a very important issue we need to address. Now, it is hard to discuss it right now. We can only probably start serious negotiation after, also to think on the ways how to rebuild trust based on the negotiated end of this war. It will be difficult to build trust in the case of defeat of one of the sides. We would need to think and engage in discussion on the confidence and security building measures. We need to come back to the discussions on arms control. There can be different platforms for discussion of these issues. One, what mentioned here, and of course very close to our heart here in Vienna, is the OSCE. possible platform, which doesn't exist, of course, anymore, is the NATO-Russia Council. The strategic stability issues we would need to come back to those discussions on the bilateral US-Russia track. But generally, if we discuss the ways how we can rethink the European security order in the future, I think the key question here is coming back to the dilemmas, addressing the dilemmas of European security, the fundamental dilemma between the freedom to choose your security alliances and indivisibility of security, which means that one state cannot increase its security if it decreases the security of another state. And here, of course, we are coming very much to the discussion about the status, the security guarantees, once again, of countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. And at some point, we will also need to take into account security concerns of the Russian Federation when it will be ready to become and to play along the norms, international norms and principles, and think which role Russia could play in the new European security order. I think that's a very important point.
That's the very long term at the moment. What is happening right now is that we're offering EU membership for Ukraine and Moldova. There is discussion about NATO membership of Ukraine as well. So it seems like we're drawing new borders in Europe, and we're trying to somehow define what is the good part of Europe and what is the other part of Europe. Is that a way forward, Louisa? Is that kind of the Europe we're building? Is that a stable and sustainable European security architecture? It's a suggestive question.
Yeah, no, and I think, I would worry very much about, drawing such new borders. I mean, again, because I think it's contradictory to the nature of the European project. I mean, of course, offering prospects for accession, it had to happen. Now, whether, these prospects will be actually realized in a short time frame is another question. I mean, considering, how many states have been in accession waiting rooms for a very, very long time. I think what troubles me about that is, one, that it is driven by war. I mean, and I've said this already this morning, and, I think Europe was made by war in many ways, but I don't think, its extensions now should be driven by military considerations or security considerations. But also, I think this drawing of lines, I mean, I was going to say at the very outset, I mean, I understand the kind of provocative title of this panel, so how the West deals with the crisis in Europe. I mean, what is the West? I mean, I think, Hannes was already hinting at that. It's a problematic category, but also I think drawing, whether it is through deciding where accession stops or where Europe ends, I mean, that is not opening a way to possible future dialogue. I mean, defining this conflict in civilizational categories, in, absolute categories, is no way, to any kind of dialogue in the future. So I think that would worry me. And also reducing this to simply a question of military security rather than, security much more broadly conceived. And that works across various scales, as General Frank was saying earlier.
Thank you very much. And coming back to General Frank, normally when the military comes into the center of the focus, generals do worry. What is happening right now at the European Union, and Louisa described it a little bit, is a strong focus on security, on defense. We have the peace facility, and we have increasing defense budgets all over Europe. And Alexandra already mentioned that the current moment in Europe and Europe's security is defined by deterrence. But the toolbox of the European Union is far broader, and that is, I think, the main difference between NATO and the European Union. How do you see this toolbox to be applied at the current crisis? I understand that at the moment military is very much important, but what could be the next steps for the European Union to deal in the longer term with this necessity to, on the one hand, deter, but on the other hand, also cooperate?
Yeah, you touch upon a very important point. Yeah, so starting from the military side, you are right that now the within, I think, all throughout Europe, governments made the decision to increase the defense budgets. Yeah? So I think if we are now 2021 about 216 billion euro, and this will increase accordingly to the decisions already made by governments, including Austria, yeah, up to 286 billion euro. Yeah? So this is quite a large number. But from my point of view, what is even more important than the absolute figures is how do we spend this incoming money. And there are more or less just two ways to spend this money. Either we go the national way, yeah, or renationalization, and every European member state tries to repair its damages of the past, yeah, and builds its own, yeah, autonomous army, so to say, what is, from my point of view, not possible, because no army in Europe can afford all the future military requirements, from space to cyber, from tanks to air force. Yeah? Or the other way, we spend it more wisely. We really do. We do not need new concepts in Europe. We have, like in Austria, Franz is smiling, yeah? We have already all the concepts in place. Yeah? And our heads of states and government, yeah, of the 27 EU member states, they have agreed to spend 35% of the defense budget for common European projects. 35%. Yeah? Last 2020, 2 years ago, the figure was 11%, and last year it was 8%. So cooperation is going down and not up. And now we have exactly the opportunity. There is a window of opportunity. Either we keep the fragmentation of the defense landscape in Europe, or we stick to those decisions which have already been made and cooperate more closely together. And then, of course, it would be much cheaper. It would be economically much more wise, yeah, to coordinate defense spending. Because what you can imagine now is all the storages are nearly empty. Yeah? So the West, the Europeans, yeah, but also the Americans, they have delivered so much amount of, let's say, for example, ammunition, yeah, of various types, from artillery to air defense, etc., to Ukraine, yeah, that they need to replenish their stocks. And now you can imagine if you would be on the side of the defense industry and 27 single armaments director would come to you and say, okay, I would need this and that amount of ammunition. Yeah? You can easily play against them and rise the costs. Or if you would imagine that you have one single negotiator coming for the European Union, and he's like would negotiate like we have done with the vaccines or other things which we're already currently procuring on European level to coordinate. It would make it much easier and much cheaper for especially. This is just some remarks with regard to spending. And the other thing is, of course, it's not only security, and we from the military, we really know it, and we support it on a day-to-day basis in our work. It's all about civil-military cooperation. Yeah? So nearly all the security issues, most of them need a civil-military approach to deal with them. Yeah? And what I see is, what I would like to see is at the same time when we are raising defense budget, that we are at the same time increasing our development aid and our capacity for civilian crisis management capacities, because you need in regional crisis, you need policemen as well as experts which are able to deal with disaster situation and project managers, etc. So you need, if you want to enhance your security in a comprehensive manner, you need all the various systems. So it's not only about it's about defense and military, because we are not remilitarizing, we are just compensating for what has been saved during or not spent on defense during the so famous peace dividend. No? So over the last 20 years or so, where all the defense budgets were more or less going down. So just one figure, for example, Germany had around 2,000 tanks before this period of the post-Cold War era started, and now today they have around 200. So, and if you compare this to what's going on in the Ukraine, you see that it's nothing about remilitarization, but to come back to some form of a reasonable quantitative and qualitative level of defense.
Thank you very much. So being prepared for the worst, but still try to pursue peace. I'd like to go to the public in a second, so prepare your question and be prepared for very short questions, otherwise I'll cut you off. No comments, just questions, please. But I want to ask a question to Hannes before that. One of our participants today said that despite all the complexity and the very difficult understanding of the situation, it's also a moment of clarity. So when in 1991 the doors of cooperation opened with Russia, he said, today the doors are closed because of the atrocities happening in Ukraine, because of the unprovoked war against Ukraine and the things done by the Russian military and paramilitary done there. Do you see that like that? Are the doors closed forever, or how should we deal with the situation?
I think the door cannot be closed, must not be closed forever, because we live on the same continent. Or have common borders. Now, I'm not so critical as LUIZA are, because the European Union always has borders. You have to have borders. Unfortunately, it's done by the war. Unfortunately, by the war, what we discussed in European Parliament years ago already on the position of Ukraine as a candidate of European Union, now Russia enforced it, so to say. Yes, the bad thing is the war, the bad thing is not that new borders will come. But of course, again, it is a question how open these borders are. When the Soviet Union broke down, the European Union offered a modernization partnership to Russia. Now you can say this was a bit of arrogance. We are the modern one, and now you poor guys, we help you to modernize yourself. Perhaps the term was not good, the conditions were not the best, but in any way, modern countries should be countries where, of course, you spend the money not for oligarchs and for their boats and ships in the Mediterranean and their houses in London, but in modernizing the country. This Putin didn't do. He had no interest, and the oligarchs had no interest. They have so much money, and you see it already now. Still, they get a lot of money, but they don't put it in the war and not in the modernization. So I think we have a common interest in having a neighbor which is going into an economic well-being and economic development in the interest of their own citizens. We have an interest on borders where you have a visa-free communication between Russia and us. So this is our interest, because all the issues now with closing the border, even preventing people who want to leave the country because they don't want to join the army and the war is absolutely crazy. What is done, for example, in Finland, according to my opinion. Of course, we all have to be careful who is coming. But to close the border and to close the door is absolutely nonsense. So, as in energy, we know that we need more oil and gas from whatever place we are. We can get it, but we have already think now on the energy transition towards sustainable, climate-neutral energy. The same as with Russia. We know that we have to fight and support Ukraine, and this war has to be fought, and Russia must not win. But at the same time, we already have to think about when Russia is either defeated or at least not winning, how we can open the doors again for talks and discussions on the common future on this continent.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder on open doors, Europeans and I think NATO is specialist on opening doors that you can't go through. So we need to think about doors that are really open. The first question was the lady here in the second row. Just wait for the microphone, please. And short question, please.
Yes, I have a question for General Frank. You said Russia must not win. Who do you think will win, Russia or Ukraine?
Thank you very much. And there is another lady in the second row as well, please. wonderfully short question. Thanks.
I would like to come back what Mr. Swoboda said about cooperation in other fields, but we had all of this. I was for years involved in civil society cooperation with Russia, inter alia also in the academic field, university partnerships, research cooperation, but it was literally destroyed, and finally destroyed on the 24th of February. And most of the academic world in Russia is complying with the system. They are not opposing it. We had some declarations by scientists immediately after the war started, where actually not only 100, meanwhile thousands of scientists, even from Novosibirsk, where I spent a couple of years, against the war. But since then, it stopped. And I would like to know how, or would like all participants to ask, how can we resume this cooperation which was there, which was very active, and which was also successful?
Thank you very much. Do we have a third question? Yeah, the gentleman back there, and then we go to the left after giving back to the panel.
Thank you very much. I'm here in the public part as a private person only, but very much interested in European politics and also in defining and defending European interests in these terrible times. Following the lady before, resuming the difficult situation, how we can tackle with aggressive regimes in the multilateral security architecture of the United Nations Security Council and the OSCE. I think it's time to admit that we need another and different system. It could not be peace enforcing by unanimity if you have an aggressor. So maybe we can change the rules to get really instruments for getting peace again.
Thank you very much. I'll give that back to the panel. Who will win? To General Frank, resuming cooperation, when and how, and then how to deal with aggressive regimes in the rules-based order. Maybe should we change the rules? And be very quick on that, because we want to go also to the left side of the room. General Frank.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think currently Ukraine is on the initiative side, yeah. But I would say who will win in the end depends on the sustainability of the support of the West. So if I would be a little bit provocative, I would say that it depends on all of you here. So if the center of gravity in this war lies within the population as well on the Western side as well as on the Russian side, yeah? And if the solidarity of the Western community will remain as it has been in the last month, then the Ukraine has a good perspective to survive as a sovereign country in this conflict. If not, it will be an uphill struggle for them, yeah, because they really depend on Western support in this regard. And just for the last question, because I cannot touch upon all the issues, how to deal with a revisionist actor within a security order. You just have more or less three strategic options. The first option is appeasement. So you give him or her what he or she wants. The second option is you buy off his option of violence. So be it through trade or through money or what else. Yeah? Or the third one is deterrence and defense. You can combine 1 and 2, but not 3.
Thank you very much. Louisa.
I'll just be very quick. I think, one thing kind of coming back to whether there will be continued support and solidarity. I think, one of our colleagues this morning, noted that this is the first time that the EU's external action, its foreign policy choices, come with direct trade-offs for Europeans. I mean, whether it's in energy prices or other effects of the war. Of course, they are nothing compared to the effects of the war on those being subject to the war. Nevertheless, whether that will remain, I think, is a question. And regarding your question on unanimity, I'm assuming also referring to the EU, perhaps this is something up for discussion, because I think, I don't believe the differences between member states, whether regarding military spending or, what we want Europe to be and to do, will go away. They will not.
Thank you very much. Alexandra, I think you can answer the question about resuming cooperation.
Yes, well, I would be happy also maybe to reply a few more questions. Maybe first of all, yes, on the cooperation on the specific topics. So you mentioned that there are no more contacts maybe after the 24th of February, and that is understandable. But then I think the question of what is called with this difficult word of compartmentalization or decoupling, the issues that we are in common interest and that we can all work together. And that could be specifically scientific questions from the war in Ukraine. That is one of the ways to continue dialogue. It is very difficult. It is very hard to engage with interlocutors. But then when we focus on those technical issues, for instance, we run a dialogue on Arctic, and that is something that still could be done on the level, not on the political level, but on the level of experts, and that is something that is still feasible. And maybe just a small comment also on basically if we need to change the rules to get the aggressor punished. Well, I believe that basically we have all the rules and mechanisms. We maybe need to think how we use them, because it is also true that there is certain impunity of great powers who are not respecting the international rules and norms. And Russia, of course, should be put into the question, but then we should also apply these rules equally to all the states, and that maybe would help for the future aggressors to prevent them from violating these rules, if we know that the reply will be the same for every state, depending on if it's a great power or not.
As a Brazilian politician put it to me, live by what you preach. Hannes.
Very briefly to just what has been said, I think, first of all, we have to integrate the people who have fleeing and have been expelled from Russia, scientists and so on. Very often it is a very critical position here, and not to touch anything with the Russian. So this is the one thing. And the second thing, in addition to what has been said, it's our mindset. We have to change. Some people have that mindset, Russia forever is off limits. And we have to say, no, not forever. It will not be possible to have a dialogue with Mr. Putin, but there will be a time afterwards, and hopefully it comes soon. We don't know. We cannot influence it really. But this has to be open, because many of the issues have been mentioned in the region, environmental issues and so on, have to be done together. And whatever we can do pragmatic, like in the Arctic, has to be done now without respect if he's a Russian, Ukrainian, or whatever his nationality is.
Thank you very much, Hannes. And we go to the left side of the room, the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then the lady in the back.
Thank you.
Just
before I put a very brief question to General Frank, I'd like to make one provocative point. I think Ukraine cannot win this war. It's impossible, because there's such a striking air superiority on the part of the Russians. Why I'm saying that? Because then I think that the West, and I'm saying the West and not only the European Union, because the United States has its own agenda. I fully agree with Hannes Swoboda. We have to look beyond, of course, and perhaps the West has to exert maximum pressure on both sides. The question to General Frank is, I do not understand, NATO always has been a defensive alliance. Why is it not possible to counter this monstrous lie of Putin that one wants to destroy and to weaken his country. Why perhaps the Secretary General of NATO should come out and say, look, we never have been an aggressive alliance. We will, if you cross the line, we will respond. But on the other hand, we have no intention whatsoever to attack or to weaken your country. Why don't they do that? Question to General Frank.
Thank you very much. I think we have a Russian expert in the room who can answer that better than General Frank. But the lady in the back was first, if that's okay with you.
Thank you. My question is, I know we've been talking about much looking beyond the present war, but aren't you afraid at this very point that the war might extend to Belarus or even to Kaliningrad, as has been mentioned by my friends from the Baltic states? Is that an option, you think? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the lady on the left, and that's the last question, and then the microphone goes directly to Greg Yudin, who can answer the question about Russian discourse. Please.
Thank you very much. I have two questions for you. The first deals with the relevance of the setting of a peacekeeping operation from the United Nations in Ukraine in the wake of the conflict. That is to say, should we lead an international action in this area, or should we trust Europe in priority to deal with the peace-setting situation if necessary? And my second question is maybe more for General Franks. Don't you think that if we call for the army to set peace regularly, it's just because civilian action is not efficient enough? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just give the microphone to Greg, who can answer the question why it doesn't help if General Stoltenberg makes this statement. Greg.
Yeah, sorry for jumping in. Just Christos suggested me to address this question. I mean, I understand where this question comes from, of course. Well, just to give, like it or not, but the mindset of current Russian leadership is that NATO, by its nature, is determined to expand, and whereas it is bound to expand to, I mean, not just NATO, but the American-led Western Bloc is bound to expand. When it expands to Ukraine, so Ukraine becomes a stronghold for, well, as I say, alternative for the regime in Russia, or a stronghold for an opposition that would emerge in Russia. So we have to understand that the causes of this war is that Putin was definitely facing an uprising in the coming years in Russia, and the situation was deteriorating for him. So for him, the very fact of military cooperation between Ukraine and the United States, for instance, is an existential threat. So it's not something you can avoid, and therefore this idea that Ukraine cannot exist. So unfortunately, it just doesn't fit. This argument wouldn't fit within the framework within which Russian leadership is operating. Even though, of course, we'll all be happy if Putin would have accepted this smart idea of NATO just stopping to threaten Russia.
Thank you very much, Greg, for bringing this perspective into play. I'll give the questions back to the panel. It were short questions, and I think they can be answered shortly. And I'll add one more for you to finish the round, because we've talked a lot about Russia this evening and the longer term. But what about Ukraine and the short term? What kind of actions do you think either the European Union or the West in general can pursue? And I'm not talking about weapons deliveries only, to enhance the situation in Ukraine right now for the people there. General Frank, most of the questions were directed to you, so you begin and we go in the same direction as before.
Yeah, I think the NATO question has now been dealt with. The other question, I think, there was if there is a further risk of escalation. Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say yes. Yeah, as well geographically as well as horizontally. So means including other geographical areas, but other, let's say, areas of living, strategic communication, etc. So there is escalation. There is an escalation risk. Today, for example, we saw that some of the missiles which have hit Ukraine this morning, they were fired over Moldova. So Moldova is a neutral country with hardly any possibilities to defend itself, being not part of a greater community. So unfortunately, yes, there is escalation risk, and we have very carefully to be on the strategic level to manage this risk, so that that we all do everything, especially with back channel diplomacy, to avoid this escalation, potential escalations. And the young lady in the third row, with regard to the option of a peacekeeping operation. So, as the word in itself already says, before you start such an operation, you need in the first place to have peace. And of course, the question is then which peace to keep. Will it be the borders before 2040? Will it be the borders of before February this year, or will it be the border between Ukraine and Russian forces when the fighting comes to an end? And then, of course, is the question: who is the most appropriate actor to organize such an operation, which is very hypothetical. So this is not on the planning schedule, so nobody is really planning at the moment this scenario. But from my point of view, of course, NATO would not be the most appropriate organization for organizing such an operation.
And what to do for Ukraine?
From the military perspective, I think in the short to medium term, follow what we are doing now. The next step will definitely be this training mission for up to 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers. This will be the next step, and this will, from my point of view, give more sustainability to what the EU countries or European countries are already doing on a bilateral basis. Because if you do it in the context of the European Union, you have much more financial resources. You can give this support much more longer term perspective, and more or less at the end it will be the task will be, of course, enormous with regard to the economic recovery and rebuilding of the Ukraine. I've read some figures about 400 billion euros for economic recovery, and you can imagine who will pay this. This will be mostly on one side of the Atlantic and not on the other side. And of course, this is true for rebuilding the Ukraine armed forces after the war, when we are there as well, and to make them as interoperable with Western standards as possible, as one of the preconditions for their further integration into Western structures.
Thank you very much. That was already a real package. Louisa.
So I think, very, very quickly on, the further geographies of this conflict. I mean, I would, kind of say that it's unlikely, to abate. Where it will spread, I mean, it's interesting because, those understandings from the very first days of the war, I mean, certainly the discussion in Poland about the Suwałki Gap being the next, avenue were already there in March. And, that also goes to very different kind of perceptions of where the threat will lie from different member states, naturally. Regarding, kind of linking your question about what should be done next in assistance to Ukraine, and coming back actually to your question, whether it's military assistance when civilian assistance is not possible or it's not sufficient. The question of reconstruction is very important, and those discussions are already beginning, including, I had this conversation earlier today with one of the other participants, by European cities who are already starting to do this. So Rotterdam and Amsterdam are leading already a group of European cities to provide assistance in reconstruction, urban reconstruction efforts. But there's a very concrete thing that can be done. I mean, so much was said about, this wonderful thing that was the Temporary Protection Directive. Guess what? It's already beginning to run out. So much for, kind of the great solidarity we've demonstrated. In many contexts, I mean, those forms of protection are running out. There isn't, in many national contexts, much that follows. Even in Poland, that has been held up as, a great example of hospitality, many people have started to return. Actually, big numbers of people have started to return. They may come back, whether because they're experiencing direct racism or because, the forms of protection that were, so widely hailed are, very quickly running out. So I think, support to those who have already fled and are in EU member states would be a first step.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Alexandra, what can we do in the short term?
Yes, if I may just first give a quick reply, yes, on the question about the UN peacekeeping operation in Ukraine. Well, I think that obviously in this case, so far this is not possible, as it would require basically the consent, of the parties. It would require, of course, the mandate of the UN Security Council, which we cannot imagine so far. What we can think is basically to see how the OSCE toolbox could be used in Ukraine after a ceasefire, or building on the OSCE experiences with the SMM mission in Ukraine. I think that OSCE would be the best organization to participate and to be involved in Ukraine, but of course after a certain ceasefire is signed. On Ukraine, I will maybe look on a different perspective. We need to accept also the geography of this conflict, as Louisa say, and the fact that Ukraine has this biggest neighbor on its borders. And I think what would be important is to understand what would be the acceptable negotiated end for Ukraine in this war, what would be acceptable for Ukraine in terms of its status, in terms of its security guarantees, but also what would be acceptable for the West in this situation. And only by working together on these issues we can think of sustainable peace and not something that will come back to confrontation in a few years again.
Thank you very much. Hannes, short reply.
Yeah, just to continue, when we speak about possible NATO membership of Ukraine or about neutrality of Ukraine, which Ukraine? In which borders? This is the big issue. I think which borders can be accepted by Ukraine itself and by Russia and by the West. Now, what many people forget is there was a referendum for the independence of Ukraine. In all regions of Ukraine, there was a majority for independence of Ukraine. The lowest was, I think, in Crimea, but still there was a majority. So the idea, okay, the East is anyway more or less Russian, is wrong. And Putin did a lot in order to convince even people who have been in doubt to go to the Russian side or to the Ukrainian side, push them towards the Ukrainian side. Nevertheless, reality means that some compromise has to be made. And compromises are always also territorial issues. Now, the real big problem is if you look to other compromises on the territory, so to say, let's say South Tyrol or whatever, is that if you have neighbors and if you have countries who have an open mind and have a cooperative attitude, you can solve the issue. Russia could have solved the issue if it would have made offers to Ukraine on cooperation, on support, not on dependence, but on support and cooperation. But this was not done. And the real issue is Russia or the new administration, the successor of Putin, are they able to say, my concept is not imperialism, my concept is cooperation, as it is more or less the concept of European Union. That's the big issue. And as long as this is not clear, the West has to support Ukraine, but the decision of what is ceasefire or what can be the compromise has to be done by Ukraine and, of course, also the West and European Union, because we support a lot. We are part of the war not with soldiers, but with ammunition, with military equipment, with political support, with economic support. So I think it must be a joint decision of Ukraine and the West what kind of compromise can be the result, at least for a ceasefire and maybe later for a real peace solution.
Thank you very much, Hannes. We have come to an end, and we started with the question, militarization for peace. I think we came to the answer of a yes, but. We need militarization, we need kind of a strong and credible defense, but we also need solidarity, solidarity inside of Europe, but also with broader parts of Europe. We need to follow through with our promises about membership, about support, and that also affects the Western Balkans, for example. And I think we also need to be a bit humble about what we can achieve as Europeans and as European member states. It's a lot, but it's not everything. There's the United States involved, there are other states involved. So the efforts for peace are more and more. And I'd like to thank especially General Frank, because he said it depends on the people. And I haven't heard many politicians saying that the outcome of this war, the future European security architecture, depends on every one of us. And therefore, we continue with militarization, but also other efforts for peace. And with that, I'd like to thank very, very much the panel. Thanks for your inputs. Thanks for your ideas, concepts, and openness. Thanks for your questions and your presence. And with that, I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.